Welcome to Undiscarded, Stories of New York, a podcast brought to you by the City Reliquary Museum and Civic Organization in Brooklyn. My guest today is proud Brooklyn native Richie Narvaez, the celebrated and award-winning author of books including the short story collections Puerto Rican and Roach Killer, and the novels Holly Hernandez and the Death of Disco and Hipster Death Rattle.
I am a New Rican, which means that my parents were Puerto Rican. I'm Puerto Rican, and New Rican is one of those labels that we use for someone who's fairly Americanized and a New Yorker as well as a Puerto Rican.
And you're right from around here. You grew up in Williamsburg, actually.
Yes, I was born in Greenpoint Hospital, which is on the edge of Williamsburg, and I was raised on South 2nd Street between Bedford and Berry, which is about 6 blocks from here. And I was raised in the 70s and 80s in the South Side, or Los Sures, as we used to say.
Richie is here to talk about one of the more unusual items in the reliquary's collection, and that's saying a lot. It's an object that originally stood in the window of La Villita, a Mexican bakery that operated on the corner of Bedford Avenue and Grand Street in Williamsburg for many years until finally closing in 2013.
Villita was a Mexican-owned bakery,
Yep.
And they were just like my people, the Puerto Ricans. They came here trying to make it. But
Alfonso Xoxa and Maribel. Yeah. And they, I think, were in business for 17 years. What we're looking at is a cake. A fake cake, actually. A large construction of styrofoam and cardboard covered with real icing. And I have to say, this cake, at least in its current condition, is definitely striking. But I wouldn't exactly call it beautiful. Usually it's in the front room and it's kind of the centerpiece right when you walk in. It commands curiosity instantly when you see it. Today we've moved it down next to us so we can get a better look at it. I had imagined once upon a time maybe it was white with a couple of pastel-y colors.
Possibly.
Yeah,
I think you'd have to do some archaeological digging inside to find out what it really was once.
So what it is a 3-tiered display cake, and it's like ornately decorated with piped icing. You know, I could imagine that icing being a really rich buttercream, full of sugar, right?
Yes, larded with sugar. It has this lovely tulle, I guess is what this material is. It's all around it like a skirt. It's sort of gorgeously grotesque because this thing must be 10 years old by now. The store where it came from, the bakery La Villita, closed in 2013. So it's got to be at least that old, right? It is.
I mean, it could be from the 80s. We don't know.
Oh my
Who
God.
knows?
So
it looks like it.
Yeah, it looks like it's from the 80s. Except, wow. Yeah, so it's got this brownish reddish tint, the whatever it was, that's what it became. It looked like it might have had some mold at some point.
A little bit, because you described this lovely tool, but it's not actually very lovely. Like,
no, it's not. It's
kind of gross and covered with dirt. They've done their best to preserve it. I think, what did he say? Originally, it was like a coarse styrofoam with icing on top, and the owners used to update these. But this, of course, has been frozen in time.
Yes, this has not been, normally a cake like this would have been chucked, but this one has been here in the museum, I don't know how many years, but yeah, it's a fascinating piece of time.
And atop this rather outlandish sugar pile is an even more outlandish figure. A plastic doll in the shape of a near-naked woman.
The most remarkable thing, of course, about it is sitting atop rather daintily is
almost like a pinup doll, right?
Very much like a pinup.
Hither,
oh my God! Yes, yeah.
Pose.
Oh, that's so. Yeah, and I guess that was meant to entice people. Sort of a cupcake on top of a cake. So she's there's a doll of a woman, a brunette, just in case people are curious, in a see-through dolly. What do they call that kind of nightgown? Just a nightie.
A nightie, I guess. A nightgown, 1950s harkening,
yes.
yeah.
And she's looking rather coquettish atop the cake. And this is the way she was displayed in front of La Villita.
For those of you not able to look at the photographs of this cake on our website, and you really should do that later, I need to make sure you're picturing this woman properly. She's not a small, demure plastic sculpture like you might see on top of a pristine white wedding cake, but rather a full-on adult cartoon pinup, looking somewhere between Betty Page and Betty Boop, sitting in a boudoir pose with her ample chest and backside on full display beneath her completely transparent nightgown. She's also quite large, taking up around half of the total real estate on top of her cake. In the many years she was sitting in the window of La Villita, she became kind of a neighborhood mascot. And somewhere along the way, she acquired the name Xoxa, spelt Xoxa.
It's funny enough. So I said I had gone to college in the 80s and I came back in the 90s. So I started I moved to a different part of the area over across the BQE, which separates Williamsburg straight through in the middle. Thank you, Robert Moses. So I was on the other side, but I was dating someone who was over on this side by the Williamsburg Bridge over by the water. And I would pass by Villita every once in a while, and then I would go and get an egg sandwich, and I would see Xoxa and her companion. I forget his name is.
His name was apparently Marcus Cunnilingus, and this was. They were anointed this by Remez Cala, which was I think a Latin blog zine at the time, and it evolved into a big Latin media company.
Right, Remezcla.
I just want to correct her boyfriend's name. It's not Marcus, it's Marcilius.
Marcilius. So they I guess they ended up loving her. They must have lived nearby. But yeah, so she had a companion, sort of like the Ken to her Barbie. Mm-hmm. And you would see them in the window, not quite in this state of disarray. The cake wasn't this far gone, but you would see them in the window quite often. And there's a weird push-pull. Because the food was great, but also, like in a lot of bakeries that have cake displays that last a while, it's almost like a warning, like, oh, you should change that. So there was a weird thing. But the thing is, inside the store, it was a really a lovely bakery. It's very typical of the area. They had my favorite thing was the egg sandwiches and the sandwiches. They used a thing that I grew up with in a lot of Puerto Rican cooking, the plancha. Which an iron. So they would iron the sandwiches. I don't know if you've probably seen one where it's two big things of metal, and they usually line it with aluminum, and they would put the sandwiches in there, and they would flatten them, and it would be delicious, crunchy on the outside
and easy on the wallet.
Yes. Oh yeah, very inexpensive.
As Williamsburg shifted over the course of the 90s and 2000s. Puerto Rican and Mexican families were displaced first by a wave of young artists and creatives, and then by rich white people. Remezcla, the blog we mentioned earlier, covered the shift from a Latino perspective, and they adopted our friend Xoxa, the dessert pinup, as their mascot, making her a symbol of the local color that gentrification threatened to displace. For several years, they even gave out Xoxa awards to their favorite people and places in the neighborhood. So when you look at this artifact, in all its ugly glory, how do you feel? Like, what does it bring up in you?
I could write all these things about it. The thing is, partly is itself in its own grotesquerie is kind of wonderful, also kind of kitschy in a sense, kitschy in that way that part of what attracted, I think, a lot of the artists to the neighborhood was they looked on the blue-collar people working here as sort of this kitschy, tacky blue-collar people. I think they very much condescended and patronized towards the people who lived in the neighborhood. So this kind of symbolizes that. But at the same time, as I try to get into the mindset of Alfonso, I can see he must have had a quirky sense of humor, because if you're going to run a family bakery and you have a little a nude woman in a dolly, just sort of as
her nipples are also like brightly painted. I think it's been touched up.
I didn't want to mention her nipples, yes, but they might have been either maybe she did it herself, but likely it was Alfonso or maybe his wife, but somebody touched up that. And the thing is, family bakery. As I was thinking about this, it's like, this would not go in Park Slope. In Park Slope, the mothers would be, oh my God, you can't have that in the window. But there's something about Williamsburg, which is a little bit has always been a little bit of a rougher town. It would be more cute and not taken seriously. Certainly, my mother would have just giggled and gone inside for some coffee.
Well, it's definitely a good marketing ploy because when I was doing my research on the bakery, all I kept seeing was people mentioning the cake toppers and the display windows. Mm-hmm. So Alfonso was on to something.
Yeah. I mean, it might, if it was made today, it might have ended up a meme or something. Certainly would have ended up on Instagram or TikTok. Somebody would have talked about, oh my God, look at this cake display. But as it was just a great way to get word of mouth and people to know that's the bakery with the nude lady in the window with her companion, Mr. Cunnilingus, who was used to sit right next to her on another cake. Yeah, but it's sad when I think, I remember when it came in there and I was so happy that there were Latino businesses starting in the area because I had seen gentrification. I was like, oh, good. Hey, new Latino business. Great. But I think like many businesses that started then, it's really hard for, given the Williamsburg, where there's high turnover of interest and all this conspicuous consumerism in this area. It's a wonder it lasted. It's great that it lasted. It had a corner spot. Amazing.
Yep. Prime spot.
And now it's a salt and charcoal fancy restaurant.
So what do you think attracted your community to this area to begin with?
Well, that has to do with, Williamsburg used to be a fancy schmancy place in the 1800s. This is where the rich were. It was his own city, Williamsburg, at one point. But at the turn of the century, early 1900s, they built that Williamsburg Bridge that you may notice outside the window. So that changed everything because that made the neighborhood accessible to Manhattan. And then they started building factories like crazy. So all of a sudden it became a working class, blue collar town. There
are a lot of factories, if I recall. Now they've all been renamed as bars and clubs.
Right, they've all been converted. They got into loft. First, they got converted. I remember there were lofts in the 80s, and then they got converted. Now they're all fancy restaurants and everything. But yes, that all the factories attracted a lot of people coming to New York City for the first time. I think Puerto Rican started coming in. There was the Prince Spaghetti Factory, the Schaefer Factory. And a few other factories over, and Domino's, the Domino's Sugar Factory.
Domino's Sugar Factory is huge.
Right, which is now, I think, a big complex of condos.
I think they're developing it, and they're really trying to preserve some of the interior. Like they've hired, I read something in the New York Times where they've hired some architects who are really trying to work hard to maintain some of the facade. Okay. Obviously, they got to, it was a sugar factory. They got to, but they're trying to maintain some of the looks, at least in the lobby.
Yeah, and I'm sure that Domino's Sugar sign outside is sort of an historic part of the landscape out here. But yeah, so my people came here because there was factory work and stuff. My mother first moved in Rutledge Street. That's where we first lived. And now that's a Hasidic enclave. They wouldn't allow us to move in there now. But we moved there first, and then she moved over to South 2nd Street, and we lived there for many, many years. I'm surprised as I was walking around how many of the old houses are still around. Some of them look in great shape. Some of them look, any moment once this goes. But there are still, by the way, despite gentrification, there are still pockets of Puerto Ricans that live in this area. I know a lot of people moved out. Some people just wanted to get away. Some people did well, and they wanted to move to the suburbs, which is the part of the American ideal. But there are some people still here, and you can still hear salsa music and aguinaldos during Christmas season through the windows. So it's we're not completely gone from the neighborhood.
So can you describe what it was like for you growing up in this neighborhood.
Oh.
You've given me a little taste already. But how many, Spanish-owned businesses were there?
Oh, well, there weren't that many, actually. Well, we had a bodega on the corner on South 2nd and Bedford, and there would be little bodegas here and there. But a lot of stores were mostly still owned by Polish and Irish. All of us used to go to Havemeyer Street to buy clothes. Like that's where I got my clothes for my graduation in junior high school. And that was
down there,
right over there. And that was they were all still Jewish-owned stores. So the Puerto Ricans hadn't bought a lot of stuff, which I think, unfortunately, that's one of the reasons that it allows them to be gentrified. They didn't stick the land. It's all about property in New York City. But growing up, though, I was surrounded by Puerto Ricans. Williamsburg is divided into two sides. There's the south side and then the north side. So it's South 1st, South 2nd, South 3rd. So we call it the south side, or in Spanish, Los Sures, which is just the south.
Los Sures.
Yeah. And that comes from the Puerto Ricans who started moving in, my people, who started moving in the 40s, 50s, and a big time in the 60s. And we basically dominated the south side of the neighborhood. And so it was a very Puerto Rican feel. On South 2nd Street, which as I walk down today, I realize is tiny. But back then, of course, it was a giant, giant street to me. And somebody on the block had brought in a rooster. So every morning during the first few years I remember growing up, we would hear a rooster. We have a rooster waking us up. It would be on their balcony.
Whether you wanted it to or not.
Right, exactly. But my mother loved it because it reminded her of the countryside back in Ponce, where she grew up in Puerto Rico. But it was great. I mean, we had block parties. The city actually used to close off blocks in the summer and bring food to people. We used to have free summer lunches. I went to PS 84. I loved going there. I went to junior high school 50, and then eventually went to Brooklyn Tech. But I loved it. It was a wonderful experience.
So why did you decide not to live here anymore? You're up in the Bronx now.
I'm up in the Bronx now. Well, I basically got priced out. I had a nice little apartment. I enjoyed it, but everything was getting much more expensive to live here. I was sort of living, in a sense, I was living an artistic life on the edge.
You're a writer.
Yeah, I'm a writer. And then, but I ended up getting engaged, and I said, well, I can't, it's too small an apartment. So eventually moved to the Boogie Down Bronx, which I have to say is like Williamsburg used to be. We walk down Williamsburg, there are people everywhere. It's a crowded neighborhood. In the Bronx, you can still walk around, nice air, you can still see the sky. It hasn't been filled with condos yet. So
Yet.
Exactly, yeah.
So in a way, you kind of gravitated towards the kind of neighborhood that you were used to.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I found something, I think mostly by chance, but it was a really comfortable kind of area. So far, so good.
So I have to say, you wrote a book specifically trying to articulate your rage at gentrification. Are you still that angry?
You know what? So after college, I come back. I went to college in the 80s, came back to the neighborhood in the 90s. And at that point, the neighborhood started gentrifying. And this is the inspiration for Hipster Death Rattle. As I saw what was happening in the neighborhood. I could see the displacement. It was sort of like a slow motion accident happening, and I felt like there was nothing I could do. So I was just filled with bile and anger, and I was like, what can I do? So I wanted to do. My only talent was writing. I said I should write an incendiary novel that will alert people to this. But I didn't know how to write back then, a whole novel. It took me about 10 more years to be able to come up with the right plot, to be able to say what I wanted about gentrification. So, and just by the way, so the plot of the book is about a serial killer using a machete, sort of in culturally appropriating a machete in order to try to stop gentrification by increasing the crime so that nobody wants to move into the area. So it's about trying to track down that killer and also a missing woman who was being harassed by her landlord. So it's a lot about, it's in Williamsburg, it's very much about what's been happening in Williamsburg over the last 30, 40 years. People often think about writing as a kind of catharsis. to get past something. And I realized it just helped me sort of understand it better. But no, it still gets me. And sometimes when I walk around, my heart still gets on fire. In the 80s, the city was recovering and they basically didn't pay attention to any of the poor neighborhoods. So large parts of the Bronx, of Queens and Brooklyn were just left to lie fallow. The city didn't care. They were worried about Manhattan more than anything else. So when the city doesn't care, when the government doesn't care, that's when it becomes vulnerable to developers. But yeah, it was a tough neighborhood. I was here during the blackout of 1977, and there was some looting and some trouble. And we had gangs in the area, and we weren't supposed to go out at night. But it would have been nice that if there was a little bit of change, but not so massively that has happened since that day.
It used to be quite an arty neighborhood, which I think started attracting in the 90s.
Right.
The cheaper rents and, people were moving there. And that's almost sometimes nice for a neighborhood to have that influx of artists.
Yeah.
But then...
Yeah, a little bit goes a long way. That's the whole thing about gentrification. What the neighborhood needed was development and some investment in it. There were a lot of Latinos here that were just sort of left to their own devices. The city didn't care. Their pool had been falling apart, the McCarran pool over here.
It was shut for many years.
It was shut for many, many years. And so when the artists started moving in, all of a sudden, honestly, because of their skin color mostly, the developers started paying a little bit more attention, thinking, oh, we should invest in here a little bit more. And a little bit was good. But then it just escalated. And now most of the people I knew have been displaced and pushed out. And that's gentrification.
I don't want to pick at a wound, but what are some of your favorite places that are no longer here or could no longer be here? I mean, obviously we have the bakery, but...
Right, yeah, the bakery is such a sweet little place. When I heard it was going, it was so sad. It's like, oh, I thought that would last. I thought he would make so much money on that corner that it would last.
I think they had almost like a request for a $10,000 increase.
Right, yeah, that's
rent.
what I heard too.
Yeah.
It was
a month.
Huge. And like immediately, there was no like 6 months to find a new place. We just get out, and it was really a sad day. There were some. I think it might still be there as a place that makes morisoñando, which is this Puerto Rican shake with orange juice and malta and an egg.
Oh, sounds good.
Yeah, it's really supposed to be very invigorating for you. There was a couple of cuchifrito stores. Cuchifrito is this super fried. This is our sort of unhealthy but very delicious food. There were more.
I feel like all the real delicious food, unfortunately, is unhealthy.
Like I think one of them might still survive, but a few of them have been gone from from Marcy Avenue. The old movie theaters, Williamsburg Theater, I miss. I miss the way PS 84 used to look. I think it got all divided up and everything. And my old block looks very different. There are these giant buildings. Those finger buildings,
yes,
are kind of like cheap construction that go fast.
They look very flammable whenever I see them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I think they look so jarring. But other than that, I mean, when I look up at Williamsburg, when I walk around, it's mostly the people that I miss, and I think mostly I miss the feel of the neighborhood, the comfort of knowing familiar faces and people I knew, and who were all like family. Because one of the things, like going through the blackout together and going to school with everybody, the block parties that we used to have, it was in that sense that Hillary Clinton thing that takes a village to raise. The block was raising us. Everybody in the block knew you, and we respected all the elders. So it was a really nice feeling. Not everybody came from the same town, but they, you knew each other and you were struggling through the same things. So between the borders on South 2nd Street, between Bedford and Berry, that was like my town. And it felt very safe, and I felt like I knew everyone there, yeah. And that has dissipated. Also playing stoop ball. I miss playing stoop ball, because we had a nice big stoop. As you know, stoop ball, do you know what that is?
No, tell me about it.
You take...
I've heard of it, yeah.
Like a handball.
Yeah.
A handball, and then you bounce it off the stoop. And it's like handball, but you bounce, and if you hit it good enough, it's like a home run.
Might break some windows.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, certainly. You would certainly break windows. And somebody would come down if you hurt their car at all. But yeah, that stoop ball and all the playing in the street. Like we were in the street all the time. We would come in and mommy would say, "You smell like the street," because it would just be all over you from hanging out outside. Everywhere I turned, there were people I knew, and now it's mostly so many strangers. So it's a strange. It's not quite my home. It's not my home anymore.
How do you feel coming to the neighborhood today? Is it as painful for you as it was in the 90s? Like, imagine in the 90s. You were still very close to your childhood.
Yeah, it was. No, it's not as I think about it, no. I think some of those wounds may have healed. I hope.
That's good. Yeah. So now you're up in the Bronx. Do you see those forces at work and play in your neighborhood? Or there's some neighborhoods I've been told that are just impervious to gentrification?
I don't. Given the current
maybe
model,
we shouldn't mention it right here on the show.
I know, like this place, and then boom, the developers. I think that I don't know. I don't think any neighborhood is gentrification proof. Certainly, anything that has poorer people in it is super vulnerable. They've said for years, for example, that the South Bronx was never going to get gentrified because nobody with money wanted to move to the Bronx because of the reputation it had from the 70s.
It had a really bad reputation,
of the burning Bronx, which was really only a small part of it, but that's the part that got all the news.
I know that there've been a lot of artists and writers who are trying to, dispel that image and be there's so much more to the Bronx than that.
Yeah. The one thing that's nice, so the South Bronx has this giant development going on right by the water, which is likely to gentrify it. However, there has been a heavy movement, which I wish we had in Williamsburg, and I think things are better now because of the internet. People can gather and share information much better now. But they're really trying to make sure that the Bronx, at least some of the development is for the Bronx, not for somebody else coming in. That they keep it for themselves and don't get displaced. So. Yeah, there are places in my neighborhood right now. I sense a little bit of it. Sometimes like, that's an unusual person to move into the area, but that's okay. I think it's people just need places to live, and it's tough to find that. So you can't blame the people; they're just looking. But the thing is, like, I am wary now of waves where I think, oh, that's completely different. Which I remember sensing when I walked down on Bedford Avenue one time, and I walked past the El Cafe, and I was like, oh, this is St. Mark's Place. This is very different. And that's when I began sensing things were going to definitely be different.
So why is it important for this cake to be in a museum?
Oh, it's I think this cake symbolizes a moment, It's a crossover. That kitsch factor is part of that gentrification, that artsiness, but it's also this ambition coming from Alfonso of trying to make it in this city. And this is, we might not necessarily call him artsy, but this is his work of art. And he's got a sense of humor, I think. He's got a naughty little sense of humor putting Xoxa on top. So I think this is a nice symbol of him and his bakery, but also of a moment where somebody could put this in the window and of his ambition to make it in this city. It's also symbolic of him not being able to make it as long as he wanted to, but he was here for a while. And it's sort of, I guess, inevitable because of the change of the neighborhood and the city that he didn't last forever, but it's still it wonderfully captures that moment where he was, where his ambition and his art was shining. I love Xoxa. I'm very happy that she's here and somebody's preserving her. I have to say, I wish the best of luck to Alfonso. I hope wherever he is, he's doing well. And I hope he has another Xoxa with him there. I hope her partner maybe is there too. And I wish him the best of luck. And I thank you, Tania, for having me here to discuss this wonderfully iconic cake.
Definitely not one we want to taste
right.
of.
It's delicious, but intellectually.
Thank you so much, Richie. And I can't wait to read your books. Take care.
All right.
This has been Undiscarded, Stories of New York, a podcast brought to you by the City Reliquary Museum and Civic Organization in Brooklyn, New York, in partnership with Citizen Racecar. My name is Tania Muhammad, and I produce this show in collaboration with David Hoffman, who edits the stories. Post-production and original music by Jose Miguel Baez. Contributing producer Jacob Ford. Production manager Gabriela Montaquin. Outreach managers Sarah Shalantano and Candice Chantalou. You can learn more about Richie Narvaez and his brand of Latin noir on his website at www.richienarvaez.com, spelt RICHIENARVAEZ. To learn more about the artifact in this episode, check out undiscarded.org. And be sure to follow @City Reliquary on Instagram for facts and pictures. You can hear about the museum's mission, exhibits, and events at cityreliquary.org. Thank you so much for tuning into this season of Undiscarded. We really enjoyed making this show and meeting all the colorful characters that make up New York. Don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, leave us a review, and help spread the word. There are so many more stories to tell.